say, can, maybe he says.
I'm not sure your mic is on. I can't
I could explain it. There we go. Put it on. I did my clip, I did everything, but. There it is. Ah. Yeah. So we saw that Pilate just gets exasperated. He's backed in a corner, he's mad, and, at the end of the day, Jesus is going to have to be crucified. And now notice what Pilate does here in verse 19 of chapter 19. Because it's like they're getting back and forth at each other. Pilate also wrote an inscription, put it on the cross. It was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Now, he writes this in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so everybody's going to know what it says. Now, the chief priests, they're a little miffed by that. And they said, do not write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. And Pilate's got a last little dig here. What I've written, I've written. So, as I mentioned last week, Pilate gets sent to what would, I think, now be Sweden, which is where you go when you're just done with you. This is not a plum job for him. They're trying to find some place to stick him, and this is, where nobody really wants to go because those people down there are always griping and complaining and causing trouble. Josephus said that there were at least 72 people who claimed to be the Messiah in that time. Other things I've read said there were over 100 in the general time frame, maybe 25 years before and 25 years after Jesus, who claimed to be the Messiah. Let's just say 72, just for fun. Think about that. Who are these people? You can read a few of them in Acts that are referenced, and nothing came of their movement. That's why they were referenced. But why is it that only one we still talk about today? That people still discuss, people still research. And I was listening to a thing the other day, this gentleman who explained why he was moved in the direction of Jesus. And he said he had studied Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam, and that they all have a place for Jesus. They all believe that he's a prophet or a teacher or something like that. And so he said, why would they do that? Well, you can't ignore him. So it's better to try to work him in, give him a role than to just ignore him. So one of the things that I think is, I had a conference call today with 3 preachers. And anyway, we were talking about things that are happening in the church, and we were talking about some directions that were being taken by a couple of these guys and whatever. We're supposed to get back together next Wednesday and talk. Anyway, we were talking about what to us was the greatest, best, most convincing apologetic. And I said, to me, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Because there are people, I've mentioned this guy named Bart Ehrman. He's a liberal scholar who doesn't believe that. At one time, he was publicly quoted as saying, just to show you something about him, and I'll share 2 things with you, that he wasn't even sure Jesus ever lived. Well, they cornered him afterward in a conference or something to discuss what he'd been talking about. He said, well, that was a bit of an overstatement. I'm sure he must have lived. Well, yeah, it was a bit of an overstatement. And then one of the other things he does is, you may have run across this a while back, and there was a bigger group. I'll get to them in a minute. But he said, what did Jesus say? What do we really know that he said? And one of the things that he does to cast down on that is he talks about all the manuscript variations. And there are thousands of them. Oh, no. So if I were to stand up in front of an audience, being a New Testament scholar like he is, and say, we don't really know what he said. There are thousands of manuscript variations. So after him saying that, and they have whatever they have after those things, he said, well, mostly it's because scribes didn't know how to spell. And that's it. He knew that. So what accounts for the vast majority of these things? Misspelled words, transposed words. And there are rules for ancient manuscripts to figure out what they originally said. Because human beings make mistakes. Do you know that? Sure you do. And one of the things, you'll go in and you get to a word and you look back and there's the same word down here and you pick it up and you leave that out. Well, it's pretty simple to figure out what's happened. Or if you transpose words, it doesn't really matter. Or if you duplicate words. One of my many writing habits is if T-H-E is in a word, I'll put T-H-E, and for some reason, I just stop. It could be there, or they, or them, or there's a thee there, and I'm like, what are you doing? You know better than that. But you just, people do stuff. Well, that's what we're talking about. There are only two significant sections of Scripture that there's any real debate about, and neither one of them change anything. One is the long ending of Mark, and the other is the woman taken in adultery. You take both of them out, and you've not lost a thing. Now, the woman taken in adultery finds, it's there in the beginning of chapter 8, very end of chapter 7 of John, but it's found in other places in John. And one manuscript is found in Luke. And most reasonable scholars think it's something the early church knew was real. That would stick in your mind, wouldn't it? And so they knew it needed to go somewhere. And they stuck it places. But if you took it out, I love the story, but there's nothing really in there that tells you anything about Jesus other than what you would already know. So just the Gospels themselves, if you'll read them with a fair mind. And then there's the third thing is that the early church made Jesus up. They made Jesus into God. He never thought he was God. He never claimed to be God, which is ridiculous. But then the question comes up, who would have been the writer or writers in the early church that invented the Jesus of the Gospels? If you've ever had occasion to read from the church fathers, so-called, they're hopeless. They make all kinds of mistakes. They believe in all kinds of fanciful things. And the Gospels are just so good. And they have such a consistent picture of Jesus that he's not a made-up character. I've shared with you one time something that I thought was pretty strong. This Jewish rabbi in a program I watched in New Zealand was asked to comment about Jesus. And one of the things, you could tell by the way the interviewer phrased the question, that he thought the rabbi would say, well, no. He said, do you believe that Jesus worked miracles? And he said, yes. Why? He said, well, if you look at the way they're written, they're not just stuck in there willy-nilly. They make sense. They fit. He said, that's not the way people who are making things up write. And then he said, so you think he was a Messiah, I guess thinking. And he said, no. He said, no mere man, no Jewish man would ever claim to be God. Well, the one thing that's wrong with that is, first of all, he said he worked miracles, is if you happen to be the Word become flesh, what else could you do but say that's what you were? And what were predictions? Isaiah 7:14. What name was given to the virgin born one? Emmanuel. What does that mean? God with us. And there are other things that we could do. So I think that the Gospels themselves are their best apology. And one of the things I do most of the time, if I'm doing a study, and I don't even call them a study anymore, we just talk. But if I'm doing a study, first thing I do is I want to find out how familiar people are with the Bible. Because most people aren't. They're scared of it. Like if you say, turn to John 5:18, it's like panic sets in. So first of all, I give them something to let them see how the Bible is laid out, what the different parts are, why they're there. And then I give them a cheat sheet known as the concordance. and so you can look up the book here. You go to the book. It's divided into chapters and verses. So if I say John, if you don't, I said, don't hesitate to look in your concordance. I said, then go to John, find chapter 6, and then find the verse. They're immediately set at ease. They can now navigate in their Bible. And as time goes by, they know where things are. Like if I say John for the third time, there they go. So I don't want to embarrass them. I want to make it an easy thing for them to do, and I want them to have something for later to look at. What is this Bible? Because they don't know for the most part. So that's one of the things. And then the other thing is I'll usually use John to just study through it. You may have noticed I have a love for John. Actually, I like Matthew an awful lot too. But I think John is a better teach about Jesus situation. Not that Matthew's bad, but John, I just like it better. And one of the people, I've mentioned him to you before, that I've talked about as far as personal evangelism goes. Because I'm not a big fan of canned studies. And in fact, we were talking about that this afternoon, about how they don't have much to say about Jesus, which is a bit of a problem. And they tend to be closed-ended questions that have yes or no answers. Anyway, one of the things that this fellow says is you start out, he believes in many steps, M-I-N-I. And that the first step, and I've mentioned this to you, and it makes perfect sense, and a lot of times people don't understand the value of this. You have studies with people you basically like. If you have a study with somebody you basically don't like, you've been coerced in it, and you really don't want to do it in the first place. And the reason you didn't like them is probably going to mean they don't teach very accommodatively. So the first thing is, they like you. Well, Jesus was likable. He was, we'll use the word winsome, pleasing personality, somebody that you could be around and feel comfortable with. So then the first thing you come to as you go through a study and is you'll begin to ask yourself the question, who is Jesus? And you look at, well, who does he claim to be? What's up with him? And that kind of thing. And they'll see, well, he thought he was God. He thought he was a Jewish Messiah. And then what does he want me to do if that's who he is? And so they are asking you questions based upon you're giving them things to discover, which is always the best way to do things. And just let Jesus speak for himself. You remember when Philip went to his buddy Nathaniel, and he said, we found the one that Moses was talking about. And Nathaniel, he says, it's Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, what? Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And Philip doesn't go into a lengthy discussion about, hey, let's not cast aspersions on an entire town. Let's look at some Old Testament passages that would tell us we shouldn't do. What did he do? Come and see. Because Jesus is the best thing we got going for us. If conversion is make disciples, you'd kind of need to feel a little bit warm about the guy that you're going to be the disciple of and feel like, yeah, that's someone I'd really like to follow. So Pilate, I think, saw enough to bother him. He'd never run into anybody like Jesus before. I think that's the reason he puts the little snarky sign up there to make everybody mad at him. And what can they do? Nothing. But here's the thing. Nobody's ever encountered anybody like Jesus. Nobody. He's not like anybody else. He's different. So here you go. We're gonna crucify him. We've talked about that some already. They divide his garments among them, and they find out that he has a seamless garment, so they can't rip it apart at the seams. So they gamble for it so they can get it as a whole. And this is a prophecy in the Old Testament. You know, you could say maybe of some of those prophecies, well, they knew they were there, and so they orchestrated it. So, oh yeah, let's orchestrate it this way. We'll get you crucified and beaten half to death, and where people can't even recognize you. Yeah, that'll convince them. I'm for that. Let's do it. And then we'll have all these things like casting lots for his garments and piercing his side and all that. You can't do that. You can't orchestrate it if you wanted to. There's just some things that they just happen because they happen. So he's there. This has happened. And in verse 25, therefore the soldiers did these things. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw that his mother and the disciple whom he loved, which we identify as John was undoubtedly a relative, a cousin, and it's appropriate from that point of view to entrust his mother to him because family was a pretty big deal back then. Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own household. You got a guy up there, think of all he's been through. I mean, goodness gracious, he's a shred. He still cares about his mom, making sure she's going to be taken care of. And he takes care of that. John, as a loyal disciple and as a family member too, takes her in. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things had already been accomplished, to fulfill the scripture said, I am thirsty. Psalm 69:21. A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine upon a branch of hyssop and brought it to his mouth. Therefore, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Now, when they offered him this at the beginning of the crucifixion, what did he do? He refused it. Because one of the things it would do would dull your senses so that you'd sort of be not having to feel the full pain of what you were going through. That's one small humanitarian thing that crucifixion would have sometimes. But he's going to feel the full force of it. When he takes it, he's that close to dying. So it's not going to make any difference, and it fulfills prophecy. It is finished. Okay, let's go over to Matthew chapter 5. After we have the Beatitudes, what serves as somewhat as the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. And verse 17 through 20 is the formal introduction to his sermon after he's put some attitudes out there that are prerequisites to living kingdom life. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. That's the NASB, should say destroy. He did abolish it. So, and it's perfectly right to put in there destroy. In one of my Bibles, I've marked it out and written destroy. And I was talking to a person, about a year ago. And they said, we're still under the Old Testament because Jesus said that we couldn't destroy, we couldn't tamper with it. But he didn't read the whole thing, apparently. Let's read the whole thing. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth shall pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law. Okay, well, the heaven and earth hadn't passed away. See, the guy's right. I was wrong. No, wait a minute. Until all is accomplished. Let's go back. What does he say? What does he say? Therefore, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. What did he say before that? Knowing that all things had already been accomplished. So if the Bible's its best interpreter. In fact, just context and common sense is often good enough. And we saw by reading the rest of the story there in Matthew 5, one of the rules, a very common one, is if you see a 4, ask what it's there for. If you see a verse that's giving you a little trouble, one of the best things to do is read the next verse. And I can't tell you how many times in discussing the Bible with people, they'll throw a verse out. That if they just read the next verse, they'd realize. And so I said, well, read the next verse. And it's like, oh. So here he is. He's done all of this. And now we've got taking care of the body. What time of the day is it? What's the problem with him dying at such a time as this? In fact, they made sure the other two died by breaking their legs. He was already dead. But what's the hurry? Because Romans weren't in any big hurry to let people die quick. They'd let you hang up there till you're rotted. But Passover. And it's about to be nighttime. And the next day is the Sabbath. So they scurry around to get some things done. And who are the two guys who come into play with this? Joseph of Arimathea, who's a rich guy, and he has a new tomb that nobody's ever been put in. So anyway, what they do, they get you get an ossuary, and when they lay you on a shelf, and when you rot it away, they put your bones in the bone box ossuary, and there could be 15, 20 of them in a tomb, because they tend to be family tombs. But his had never been touched before. And there's another fellow, somewhat improbable, came to Jesus by night, Nicodemus. I really like the way he's portrayed in The Chosen. So, and they do what they can at the moment. And the women, the takes us to the empty tomb, which we'll get into, and the other things that he does after his resurrection. They're going, while the men are locked in a room, to finish the preparations. And what do they find? There's nobody there to prepare. He'd had a rough, slap-together thing, and one of the things that when Simon Peter and John hear about it, because they'd heard stuff and they were like incredulous, but finally, okay, and John outgraces them, and Peter goes in, and he sees the grave wrappings. And one curious thing that he sees and that is drawn attention to, the cloth over his face, the napkin, was folded up and laid on the side. I'm not sure this is right, but it could be. It's not one of those things that's just so fanciful. I think, wow, that's crazy. But I mentioned to you once before that when a master would finish his meal, he would just throw his cloth on the thing, and that would let the slave know he's done. If he was coming back, he'd fold it up. He's coming back. So, I'll, Lord willing, probably tomorrow run it off and have them ready for you. And then we'll get into chapters 20 and 21, which deal with his time after he's around for 40 days.